So Dr. Christopher Brooks' experience includes working with multinational organizations in the legal and business industries in legal English and business English training, translating and negotiating skills, as well as considerable experience in academia. Dr. Brooks' experience has made him a sought-after instructor for multinational organizations for over a decade. While living and studying in the EU, most of Dr. Brooks' work was for Germany-based organizations offering not only legal English and business English language and negotiation training, but also German English and English-German translations for international law firms and companies, academia, and judiciary. Example, the German Constitutional Court. However, he has also worked with EU and non-EU organizations on legal and business issues. This is exactly what I'm talking about. I didn't know this all about you, Chris. For his primary position, Dr. Brooks is an associate professor of history at East Stroudsburg University and is now completing his 10th year here. At ESU, he teaches legal, constitutional, modern European, African American, and intellectual history, among a few other subjects, with research and writing that crosses the disciplines of history, law, business, modern languages, and politics. He also advises widely on German and European American matters. Christopher Brooks completed a dual BA History and Philosophy and an MA American Legal History here at East Stroudsburg University of Pennsylvania. He then performed postgraduate work at Edinburgh University, Scotland, completing his doctoral work at the University of Kassel, Germany, in legal and constitutional history. His most recent book, co-authored by Dr. Nicole Ellert, PwC, is titled Expats in Germany, Inbound and Outbound, Questions Frequently Asked by Foreigners, which was published just last week by De Gruyter, and a subject he will touch upon in today's talk. Please welcome Dr. Chris Brooks.
Wow, she made me sound important. Today, I know the title of the talk is what it is, about this history of expats. That is a component of what I'm going to talk about, but really, I want to kind of link the two projects that I was working on. Started really with the sabbatical that I was granted about a year ago, and, well, actually started before that, but I'm going to talk about the two projects I worked on during my sabbatical largely. One, the book project, which was just mentioned. I'll say a little bit about that. And then, which is really more of a business law kind of thing, and the more social science history project, which, of course, is this one. So just, I want to briefly mention this book and talk a little bit about what it's about. For starters, if you're going to start to look at expatriates, and I'm going to define all of that in one moment, you kind of have to understand about the sort of legal framework within which they're working. And that's what kind of got me caught up into this particular project. Well, back up. This particular project. Actually, she was a language student of mine. She and I were just having lunch one day. I happened to be teaching a seminar over in Germany a couple summers, about 4 or 5 summers ago. This is actually our second book together. The other one was just sort of an overview in German law. We realized that there was no concise compendium that companies could use to try to simplify and understand the very complicated legal system. So this is really sort of a question and answer. You know, what is a works council? What are their competencies? What can trigger a job action, and those kinds of things. And we tried to simplify it as much as we could. And there was nothing in English. There's virtually nothing in the German language because most things written by academics include a lot of footnotes and a lot of sources, and there's nothing wrong with that. That serves a purpose, but it doesn't serve the purpose of the general public, in particular business people who just want some basic information to do their daily work. So as you see here, both projects address the German-American relationship, which is sort of my broader interest, the German-American relationship. Short bio, lived in Germany for 6 years, did my doctoral work after, studying in the UK. And while there, I had the opportunity to work in a number of German companies and law firms, and it really sort of triggered my interest. And I started to read deeper and deeper and deeper into these subjects. But to begin with the meat and potatoes of this discussion, you have to understand what an expat is. And I have this definition up here, one who is withdrawn him or herself from residence in one's native country. The history of the term can be seen negative. The expatriate can be seen as the traitor. And that's really not what I'm looking at, though. I'm looking more at those working abroad on foreign assignment. I'm not looking at the sort of sociological definition, but more the business and legal definition of the term. So, is there a definition of foreign assignment? Who's on foreign assignment? Well, under German law, there is no definition. So, for example, is it 1 month? Is it 3 months? Is it typically, you have this 1 to 5 year range, but a foreign assignment can be 3 months. There have been recent legal changes in in the labor code and German laws with respect to expats. They try to make it clear the definition and difference between a business trip and a foreign assignment, but it's somewhat muddled. Really, your short-term assignment is 3 to 12 months, but it might be 2 or 2.5. So as I was kind of alluding to before, there are exceptions. And I think with anything else, there's always exceptions. One of the other things that should be mentioned too, and that's why I have this slide up here, is that Germany tends to be a very popular location for people wanting to work abroad, as is the United States, I should add. Actually, for Germans wanting to work abroad, depending on it changes from year to year, and usually auditing companies like Ernst & Young, Price Waterhouse, they're the ones who accumulate this data. Generally, the U.S. is either number 1, 2, or 3 in popularity for Germans wanting to work abroad, and it's usually the same the other way around. So, definition of the foreign assignment, though, I should add, an assignee posted abroad is in most cases under his or her own existing contract. So in other words, that person isn't going abroad to work for a company in the foreign country. The person still has an employment contract. Now, this is another thing that's changing, particularly for the purpose of savings. I learned, actually doesn't have to do with the German-American relationship, has to do with a Brazilian going to work in Sweden, actually, where the person was sent on foreign assignment. This was 3-4 years ago. Was sent on foreign assignment, and the assignment ended, and the company, instead of having the person come back home to repatriate him, bring him back into the company, instead of that, he was more or less forced to take a local contract. The local contract was substantially less pay and so on and so forth, but I don't want to get into that here, but that is increasingly becoming more and more common. So, the assignee posted abroad is, in most cases, under his or her own existing employment contract, who is working for, in this case, a German employer, because I'm doing this under German law, or one of its foreign subsidiaries, due to special contractual agreement based on instruction to work given by the employee. So, in other words, again, they're not there seeking work. They already have work at home. So technically, they're employed in, say, an American is employed in America, just happening to do a project or whatnot in the foreign country, in this case, Germany. Or the German employee is employed in Germany, comes to America, is still employed there in Germany, which is, of course, very important for tax purposes. I'm going to jump ahead here. Legal basis for the assignment. Usually, continue on this. The length of stay, which I said, there's kind of gray. There's a 3 to 12 month or the 1 to 5 year range. I've actually heard of people on assignment for 7 years. The work to be carried out. So depending on what kind of work the person's doing, be that in a factory, a lot of it's in services, be they legal services. It could be consulting and setting up a company or a subsidiary. So that would be, of course, temporary work, bringing the know-how into the other country. Or position and situation in which the posting of the employee takes place. So these are some of the legal bases. And what I'm talking about here with legal basis is what is the person considered legally? Is the person, what with respect to pay, with respect to what sort of Social Security benefits the person's entitled to, is supposed to pay, and that kind of thing. In the interest of time, I'm not going to say too much about split employment arrangements because I don't want to go over, but one of the other sort of components to this, one of the many components to this, is the split employment arrangement. The way that usually works is when, I'm going to jump ahead here to this one, you have somebody who is working on multiple things or for multiple places, locations at the same time. Maybe 20 hours here, 10 hours there, 5 hours there. It makes things a little bit complicated, but that's also something that has become increasingly more common. So like I said, in the interest of time, I want to kind of jump ahead here to some numbers. In the news, and this is something that I think a lot of you are probably aware of. Germany has taken in a substantial number of immigrants, and I don't want to get into the political ramifications of that because that's really not within the scope of my research. It's in the within the scope of courses I teach, but not here today. But it's worth noting, you're talking about foreigners in total. As far as the asylum seekers, it's around 1 million. So you figure 800,000, over 800,000 are other people coming into Germany, usually to work, with about a little over 1 million of them being non-EU nationals. Now this is of consideration because, well, in the EU, there's rules with respect to the free movement of workers. So if I can't use Britain as an example really anymore. I guess technically I can for the next year and a half. But say I live in France and I get a job in Hamburg, it's usually not too big of a deal. There are some considerations with respect to registry. You have to register with the local town in Germany. But as far as insurances, you probably hold on to what you had in France that would cover you abroad. Actually, even with cell phone coverage, there's laws with respect to data plans and, excuse me, the carriers are not allowed to I'll just say, overcharge people. Those costs are actually year for year coming down for individuals wanting to work or live or even travel into another European country, from one European country to another. But back to this. The non-EU nationals are comprised of literally people all over the world. There's a substantial number of Chinese, a substantial number of East Africans. Perhaps you're aware, perhaps you're not. There were a couple colonies in the early 20th, late 19th, early 20th century, German colonies in East Africa. And, of course, Americans, which I will eventually get to in our talk today. You have about 685,000 people, citizens of EU countries, excluding German returners. 3.4% of non-EU nationals came to Germany for employment purposes. Now, if you think about it, again, I'm really focused on that small number, and that's self-reporting. Because even the asylum seekers may have been coming for work indirectly, because at the end of the day, people have to put food on the table. So that may not have been the primary concern, but it was definitely secondary or triternary. Does anybody have any questions right now before I move on? Okay. The 90s. And this leads into the history of the expats, and really the focus here is the troop drawdown. And I wanted to look at something that the literature didn't really cover. Because there's loads of literature on the relationship between American GIs and the locals in Germany, the treatment of women, racial disparities and attitudes on race in the two countries, the sort of attitudes of the American military over there, how they were treated too by local police. I mean, there's loads of studies on that. But what hadn't been looked at, and I'm just getting in, I just started this project, is how the the private sector workers were treated, what their experiences were, what it was like to work in Germany during the troop drawdown. And what I wanted to look at largely here is what's the impact of the military presence, all right? What was the impact of the military presence diminishing? You know, if you look at the numbers in 1991, we had over 200,000 troops in Germany. The following year, it was down to 124. By the time you get to 1996, we're down to 48,000 troops from 220,000 just 5 years earlier. That's substantial. What does that do to economies? Especially small towns like Hahn, which is now a private, I'm trying to remember the air carrier, a private air carrier kind of took over the base there. And this is a small airport. It was a U.S. Air Force base. What happened to that area? Well, they lost a ton of revenue because troops were gone. The larger cities were able to absorb a lot of this, but the small towns, it was a little bit more difficult. But the key point of, I'll just say real quick, the key point of this research was really to focus again on non-military. So, and I want to stress that because what normally comes up when I've had conversations with folks, yeah, so-and-so was stationed there, so-and-so, because we've had, between 1950 and 2000, I believe the number is 18 million people Americans lived in Germany, based on statistics which are, mostly, the troop numbers are clear, but as far as private sector people, it's very hard to keep records. There's some literature on that too, but I wanted to really focus on the non-military folks. So as I mentioned at the outset, it was these discussions, or I alluded to at the outset, it was these discussions I had with HR professionals talking about, well, back in the 90s, it was different. And the Americans were treated different. And when the bases were here, the relationship was better. And I didn't know what they were talking about because I arrived in Germany in 2001. So I had no idea what it was like in the 1990s. I was here. So I started to investigate as best I could. And then I came up with, well, barely anybody's done any work on this. And that was going to require a lot of interviews, which was one of the hurdles I had with this project. Anyway, while working in Germany, I was led to believe that there was a disparity in workplace treatment based on what people had told me. And also based on some of the readings. I mentioned this Daimler, this is with respect to a Daimler-Chrysler takeover. For example, when Daimler and Chrysler merged, 25,000 Americans lost their job because it's a lot easier to fire Americans than it is Germans because of labor contracts. Then, but more infamously, was the knife and fork training. So the American managers, if we go back to this time, were compelled, strongly compelled, to take a course in how to eat continental style. So in other words, if you're not familiar, you know, we in the United States, if you cut food, you put the fork down. Over there, you're eating with the knife and the fork and using the fork as a utensil to put food onto your fork. Little things like that. How to eat. So you can imagine if you're a mid-level manager, senior manager, you've been with company X for, say, Chrysler for 20 years or something, and somebody's trying to teach you how to eat, how that's going to go over? Not well. Not well at all. But what I wanted to get to, the interviewees, the 5 people I had the opportunity to speak with so far, I had very, very different opinions than what these HR people were telling me. The information they're telling me is that their experiences generally are pretty good, with a few exceptions, but generally pretty good. But before we get into that, and I'm going to go over some of the questions that, actually all of the questions that I asked in my questionnaire, I want to talk about some numbers. There were, according to the 1990 U.S. Census, 58 million Americans self-identified as German. 58 million Americans. Right? At the time in 1990, there was over 900,000 Americans overseas. Now that number's about 250% of that. Moving on to other numbers, average regional employment. And this is what I was talking about before with the impact of the troop drawdown. 1990-91 is about circa 4%, a little over 4% is the unemployment rate. Once you move to 1995, look at that number, we're up to 10%. Now there's other factors beside the troop drawdown. And most studies indicate in some local areas they might have seen a change in the economy of about 10%. In other areas there might have actually been an increase because different industries were able to come in, they were able to take over the bases, repurpose them and use them for industrial purposes or for airports and that kind of thing. But, you know, the aggregate, I mean, that's a substantial change in employment in a relatively short period of time. And one of the questions that I had thought of as I was going through my notes several months ago was this: were Americans considered the group taking away German jobs? Question's somewhat unanswered, and quite frankly, can be answered in multiple ways. So the folks that I talked to, one was a student at the time who was working in local restaurants, hourly wage worker. It was actually kind of interesting getting her perspective on things because it was so very different than the other expats who were there on foreign assignment. She was just a student trying to work a little bit to earn a few bucks. The other, this was probably the most fruitful interview, was with a man who was with a major engineering company. Actually, they produce things for the military. His experiences were mixed. He talked about one time when he was, excuse me, when he was visiting a local family that he had met. He was invited for dinner. He and his wife were invited for dinner, and they took him out. It was on a farm in the countryside of Germany, and they took him out to this barn, and up in the attic were all of these artifacts from World War II, things that this particular gentleman's family had kept as sort of family heirlooms. They weren't swastikas and that kind of thing, but it was more like, because his brother, I believe, the man who owned the farm, his brother had died in the war. He had been a soldier in the German army, in the Bundeswehr. So it was kind of interesting how the demeanor changed once the subject changed. Some of you in the audience are perhaps you have this, maybe have a memory of British television, Faulty Towers, Don't Talk About the War. If not, Google it, for those of you who've never seen it before. My own experience was that a lot of people were very comfortable, people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s, were comfortable talking about the war when I lived there. But I think when we go back to the 1990s, 80s, 90s, I think that experience was still relatively fresh. By the early 2000s and the aught years, the zeros, 03, 04, 05, I think there was enough time that had passed. Another decade had passed, and people were a lot more comfortable discussing it than it was for, this gentleman. Employees at a major chemical company, a number of an HR director, and a few others. Their experience is quite interesting because what happens with them is they talk about the dynamics a lot of workers who had worked in the U.S., so Germans who had worked in the U.S., as well as Americans who had worked at the plant in Germany, talking about the difference between plant workers and executives. I found it most fruitful because of the scope of experiences that these individuals had. And an HR director at a very, very large appliance producer, he was actually quite cheerful in his interview. His feedback was largely, everybody got along. There were 3 Americans, and we loved them, and they loved us, and it was very kumbaya. I wasn't sure what to make of that information, whether it was because he was so happy about it and so positive about it. I wasn't sure if he was just trying to make me feel comfortable. So, kind of hard to read. What were they asked? I want to allow you guys a few minutes for questions, so I'm not going to read each and every question to you, but I will put them up here. First, a little bit of background. I would ask what jobs they held, who they worked for, if they left the company that they had been expats for, under what circumstances, what kind of contract they were under, perks, and this one. How much, if at all, did did your work deal with the U.S. military stationed in Germany? This one I found very interesting because really here you have this triangulation. The U.S. military, non-military U.S. citizens, German citizens. And the difference between the private sector American workers and the military folks was substantial. There was some interaction between the military folks and the private sector folks, but it wasn't what one might think because their jobs are very different, security concerns, etc. You provide any examples of the contact that people had with the military folks, and actually here's where you kind of got the funny stories about the bar fights and that kind of thing. And I can tell you even in the early 2000s, there were times people just automatically assumed I was military and wouldn't let me into pubs or clubs. American Army 9. I'm not joking. Happened to me, I can think 2 or 3 occasions it happened to me. One time I was with some guys who were in the Army, but the other 2 times I was, with friends in my weightlifting club. It was just, So there was that bias, there was that fear, because unfortunately, there were some bad experiences that the Germans had with Americans living there. And then I talk about positive and negative attributes of the various business cultures. This business culture area, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, is quite substantial. I talked about the eating etiquette. There are other things. I mentioned in passing this concept of a works council. We don't have works councils in the United States. We have unions. A trade union, for example, is external to a company, and you can join there. They're supposed to help the company or organization with negotiating contracts. A works council, on the other hand, is internal. They are elected by the workers. So any company with at least 5 employees in Germany has the right to elect one representative, and then it exponentially increases. Once you get into companies with 500 employees, the employer has to provide office space, and the president of the works council is released from their work duties, and they're still paid, but for the term of service, they're basically just doing that sort of negotiating job for the works council. Now, sometimes the works council is getting into it with the union as well as the company. It's kind of confusing to us, but to kind of simplify it, basically under German law, these works councils have what are known as co-determination rights. In other words, if a company wants to fire somebody, they need to consult with, they don't need the approval of, they need to consult with the works council. Now, the works council will say, no, I think this employee is perfectly fine. Then the company can say, no, he or she did X. The works council has first rights in going and taking going before a court, a labor court, to fight that on behalf of the worker. Unions don't do that job. Works councils do. Works councils are illegal in the United States under the Fair Labor Standards Act because of perceptions and possibilities of collusion between the company and an oligarchy within the company. So works councils do not exist in the United States. In the UK they had them, but they're, I won't get into the UK. Anyway. My point with all of that was that this has a lot to do with business culture, because the company, a lot of us, your work is kind of your second home, your second family, because you spend so much of your waking day there. There, it's taken to another level. I would argue that in Germany, it's definitely taken to another level. That relationship between the employer and the employee, that familial sense. So, and there's also, and we can get into this later too, a really strict separation between private and professional life, but that relationship between worker and company is somewhat sacred. Although that's changing and has evolved over, in particular over the last 10 to 15 years, I would say it's held more sacred than it is here in the United States. If American, yeah, about the supervisor. I'll just, in the interest of time, just skip along with this one. I also asked about the ethnicity of the supervisor, whether that person was American, whether that person was German, how that might have impacted the relationship and impacted the workplace. So, issues with this study. One was funding. Because, as maybe you can tell, this topic is not a policy topic. It's not clearly a history topic, but it is a history topic, so the labor and business folks aren't that interested in it. Finding funding, because it crosses so many lines, sort of with respect to subject area, funding was a big issue. And the other was actually getting in the room and interviewing people. There were some folks who, one American who had worked in Germany during the period I was looking at, late 80s, early 90s, who had been there really from 87 to 94 or something, perfect, had moved to Dubai. Tried to do, we talked about the Skype thing, so it had become rather chaotic, and basically doing this solo and became a lot more cumbersome than I had initially intentioned or initially thought. That said, I haven't given up on it. I put it on the back burner to complete the book project, and I will be picking up on it, well, soon, because as was mentioned at the outset, the book just came out last week. So I want to thank you for your time and attention, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask them. So, questions? Sir?
You said that sometimes the union would butt up against the work council.
Yeah.
Was that in Germany? Because I thought you said that they didn't have unions, that they don't have unions.
No, they have unions in Germany. In most cases, sorry if I confused you. I said that we don't have works councils. They do have unions. But the unions, just like here, are external to the company, while the works councils are internal. So for example, there might be something internal, a change, an expansion, moving of workers from one city to another that the people within the company are perfectly happy with, but because the union is representing an entire industry, say the steel industry, there's a very large and powerful union that represents the steel industry in Germany. They might have an issue with that because it could lead to other things and what kind of precedent it sets and that kind of thing. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So would you say the work council is more of a mediator between a union and the management?
I wouldn't say that. No. It can be de facto, but de jure definitely not. Usually, in most typical cases, especially when they're negotiating a collective bargaining agreement in a larger company, the works council and the unions are usually in lockstep, usually. But like I said, typically the unions are representing an entire industry or a group of companies as opposed to just, company X at such and such a location. Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about what was necessary for you to obtain permission to work in Germany?
Okay. This is a fun story. When I arrived in Germany, I was I had all intentions of doing my doctoral work. So I was kind of torn as to whether I was going to apply for a work permit, so-called Arbeitserlaubnis, or I was going to apply for a student visa. Legally students can work in Germany. I mean, in the US, folks have to work on campus. There, you can work off campus. Actually, most expats, sort of non-German students, do work off campus. So I found it far more beneficial for me to just go for the work visa. Had at the time support system, a very small support system there. I had people who could sign for me. I had, some agreements with some language schools and stuff, so it was proof that I was employable. I had, I already had a master's degree, so they're thinking, okay, an American, there's a skill set, especially if we go back 15 years ago, language was, or more than that, 17 years ago. Somebody with those language skills who at the time had a working knowledge of German, but not a very good one. Actually, no, I had very poor knowledge of German at the time, come to think of it. That was attractive for the mere fact that I was willing and able to teach English. And I had already had written agreements when I went to the authorities stating, hey, they're going to take me on. It was a contractual basis, a consultant basis, but I had that proof. So that's how I was able to obtain a work visa. Now, after 2 years I had to renew it, the laws have changed since then, but when I had to renew it, and I was fully in this doctoral program, it became, this is actually, I think from an American perspective, kind of funny. I said that I was working full-time and doing my PhD. It's like, how is that possible? Now, we're Americans, like, if you're not working at least 30 hours a week and going to school, you're just lazy, right? So it was really, we kind of got into it. I was there for 45 minutes, and I'm like, it got a little ugly. But long story short, the renewal process became kind of complicated because I was honest about what I was doing. I was doing both. So yeah, that was basically how I did it. When somebody's working for a company here or wants to work for a company there, usually a letter of sponsor, either a work contract or a promise of, we're probably going to take Mary Jones for X amount of hours per week, as long as that calculates out to a living wage. Especially with Americans, it's usually not an issue. Usually. Actually, because it's so subjective, you could go from one office to another. I could go from Frankfurt, I could get one answer, Stuttgart, I could get a different one. That's another bone of contention for a lot of expats and a lot of companies. Yeah.
Are there laws that are standard in one country or the other that because they're an expat that don't apply, or vice versa? Like, are there German laws that would apply to Germans working over here that are not in America?
Okay, Germans working in America?
Yeah, or vice versa.
Or Americans working in Germany. Okay,
that
all right.
American laws that
Okay,
would cover
Social
them
Security, because we actually have an agreement with Germany, it's 1975, I think, on Social Security contributions. There's a dual tax treaty between the United States. It's a bilateral agreement between Germany, I think, has, I knew this number, several dozen, I'll just say, dual tax treaties with various countries.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say it's over 80 countries. And the US is definitely one of them. So with that, usually the way it works is you may be tax exempt over there, but you still have to file and pay here. That said, there have been incidents, I know out in Berlin, if we go back probably 2004, where there was a person who had been an American who had been in Germany for over 10 years and had been filing his or her taxes in the United States the whole time, paying the FICA tax, which paying the taxes in the U.S., but was hauled before a German court for not paying taxes in Germany and lost. That's the thing, enforceability and the bias of different regions and the needs of different regions. Yeah, somebody could appeal it, but you got to pay the lawyers to appeal it. So would that individual have ultimately won in the end? Most likely. But you're talking about 2 more instances before a court before you win.
Yeah. And it's like conversely, like a German working over here wouldn't pay Social Security?
No. Or Social Security would come out and those contributions would be transferred back over. Yeah.
Did you meet any resistance to any of the questions you're asking people?
Trying to think. Surprisingly not. I think when I spoke, actually, there was a pause when I spoke with one of the HR people at one of the companies when I talked about management styles and basically the business culture. There was a real pause, and I could tell by his answer he was trying not to offend me. But as far as hesitation or real resistance, I'm not answering that, no. Pause and cautious answers, only that one occasion. But
When you talk about working styles between Americans and Germans, I'm thinking there's a lot of room for cultural misunderstanding there.
tremendous. And it's kind of shocking too, because I mean, our relationship with Germany dates back to 1608. So 1608, Jamestown. Pennsylvania back to really the very founding, actually, the town Germantown. That was the largest grant. 25,000 acres was sold to the Frankfurt Company for the purpose of resettlement. That was the largest land sale that Penn made. So yeah, we have a long, long, long history with various German states. Yeah, and then post revolution, the Hessians settling throughout the Delaware Valley area. But what, could you repeat your question? I want to make sure that I
said that you were talking about American working, two working styles. Between
right.
Germans
In the sort of misconceptions and misunderstandings. Okay, let me just give you one anecdotal, one classic kind of example, and that's with vacation time, right? And we see this, and there's loads of literature in the sort of business literature on this, and the out-of-office message. I will be on vacation from July 1st till September 14th. Traveling through New Zealand and Australia. What? That means you got fired in the United States, right? And you see that kind of thing. Anything over, sort of 10 days, you sort of, what is what? We're just kind of, our heads turn, right? So, and there have been, I've actually read some of the emails, the responses. I can think of one company that was based in Texas and had operations in Germany. And some of the response from the folks over in Dallas were like, are you kidding me? Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation. You're right. So that became, no, don't let people know how long you're going to be gone. Just say you're returning when. And so that was sort of one of the cultural things. What vacation actually means, what friends mean, people socializing after work. That becomes a big thing. There's this real divide. It's actually kind of uncomfortable for that first couple of years you're there. I experience it, and most non-Germans experience it with Germans. And I should say with Germans, I'd say the folks who are in college now, that generation, is a lot more relaxed about that relationship than, say, my generation and generations prior. I think that is lessening. There's a lot more usage of first names, even in Germany.
So the standard over there is to not go out with your coworkers for a beer afterwards?
Correct. Now, at the British-based law firm that I worked at, yeah, they socialize. That's the British pub culture was injected into the firm. But at the smaller German firms, yes, they would amongst themselves on site, but they wouldn't go out together off site. And again, I think that this is evolving into something different as the economy is internationalizing at a deeper level. But when I was there were those differences, there's no question. And that's just to name a few. I could probably fill up 40 pages of those kinds of things. Yeah.
Did you spend any time in sections of the country that had formerly been East Germany?
For this project, no. I did spend some, actually, I volunteered, did some volunteer lecturing at the law school at Jena, which is in Thuringia. Maybe you've heard of Zeiss Glass Company, they're based there. One of the older institutions in Germany from the 14th century. And it was interesting.
Yeah, I bet.
The students, not so much. It was when I left campus, especially because of my skin color. That was an issue, and people kind of, luckily because of my size, nothing happened to me. But there were, I can tell you, with discussions I had with, in particular, African taxi drivers, the experiences they had were not pretty at that time. And a lot of it's regional. It's not all Germans act this way or feel this way, as you know, all Americans don't feel a certain way. So I don't want to stereotype here, but I heard some stories. But I didn't spend a lot of time in the East. I've spent a lot of time studying the East, and I've talked to folks who actually, totally unrelated to this project, really just for my teaching while I was on sabbatical, I interviewed a man in his 80s who had escaped, more or less, East Germany and had gone back to West Germany to try to get his wife's family to the West. He's still waking up with nightmares. Yeah. I mean, he had a driving school, and he remembers what he presumes were Stasi agents sitting outside waiting for him with a little notepad, sitting there just writing down on, looking at, and he'd start throwing rocks at their car, and it was kind of like, if you ever watched the show The Americans or older spy movies, yeah. But yeah, I did have that, but that wasn't really within this project, but yeah, I did. Other questions?
We were talking about the couple that took the other couple to the farm and showed them the memorabilia from the war. Mm-hmm. And that things got really uncomfortable then. For whom did things get uncomfortable?
Everyone in the room.
So
I think it was the silence. It was like an uncomfortable silence, he said. I think that the man who was showing the memorabilia didn't even realize it, but his wife was visibly kind of looking down and eventually left the room. For him, it was very uncomfortable because he wasn't sure, the guy I was interviewing, the American, he wasn't sure how to engage on the topic because, first of all, for who he's working for, I mean, they were building things for the U.S. military. Second, this man had lost someone in the war. So how do you really engage with someone in that situation? I think he was also very uncomfortable. But I think the man actually showing, hey, this was my uncle's this, and this was my brother's this, my brother's that, and he died in the war, and he used to work the farm, and just basically telling this is my family. I don't think he. I was actually trying to make sense of that myself. I won't say where was he going with that, but what sort of reaction did he actually want to evoke? I don't know.
Yeah, it makes you wonder why he took them there.
Maybe it was to remind, hey, you Americans did bad things too. I won't even get into some of those experiences I had. I mean, my first day of work in Germany was 9/11. So I can tell you, I could go on for a very, very long time about those experiences, if you wish, but maybe in another time. You had a question?
Yeah. What was your original thesis statement? And will this change depending on the results of your study, or
Yeah,
will
my
you
original-
consider dispelling it?
Yeah, well, it's kind of been dispelled already, because my initial thesis was that the American workers were treated differently during the troop drawdown. The American private sector workers who were there were treated differently during the troop drawdown. That has been disproven by the evidence.
So are you going to
But
change that, or just dispel
I think
it?
it's too early, because with only 5 or 6, actually 6 interviewees, it's too small of a study to really say this is compelling. I need to get at least a couple more dozen people to make it a valid study. I think it's too early for me to dispel that. But I'm leaning towards that pretty hard, because the people, as I indicated, the folks that I did speak with were from various industries in various, one was in Bavaria, one was in Baden-Württemberg, you had a couple in the Rhine-Main area. Nobody was up north was, that was British controlled anyway, but the point is that, yeah, different industries, different areas, and, oh yeah, Heidelberg area, that one's the other one. But they, with a few exceptions, most of them had a pretty good experience. They didn't really have the antagonism and sort of workplace harassment that I had initially, the impression I had initially gotten. But again, it's too small of a study so far for me to definitively say.
So would it be fair, like as a student and having a thesis statement and then digging into things and finding out that what you originally thought is not the case, would it be fair to turn it into a question?
What do you
Like
mean?
turn your, so you're questioning if there was disparity in the treatment of the employees.
Mhm.
Could you keep that as just your statement, or turning it into a question and building off that? Does that make sense?
So, once I've somewhat or completely disproven my initial thesis, ask a new question and base the research off of that new question?
Well, no, we can still do the same question, but instead of making it a statement like, I will prove this, that there
Right.
was a disparity, could you turn it into a question and say,
Was there a disparity?
yeah,
Yeah, that's possible.
okay. I just wonder what you do when
That's
you
possible.
fix
I'm actually just changing the statement entirely once it's been disproven, then it was disproven.
Okay.
That's one thing you just got to be honest about. I know that there are people who kind of cherry pick and try to just, well, this is what I believe in, I'm going to go out and prove it, or I'm going to use fake news or whatever. But I disagree with that. If the sources, if the facts show differently, then so be it. Anybody else?
I don't know if this was kind of asked a little before, if it was understood that way. Was there a difference, you know, between the different regions of Germany, like with Bavaria and Franconia and, you know, and maybe up in Hamburg? Was there a difference of degree with that German work culture?
There were different things. I would say Bavaria has a real strong sense of itself. I mean, in the name, it's Freistaat Bayern, Free State of Bavaria, the kingdom, the former kingdom of Bavaria, and they're very, very proud of themselves. One funny story that I really want to dig into more empirically, or into some sources on. In the chemical industry, and I don't know the exact year, it must have been the early 1980s, there was an agreement that employees could no longer consume alcoholic beverages at the plant. Well, under Bavarian law, state law, the beer is considered a foodstuff. It's not considered alcohol. Anything 5% or below is just food. It's sustenance. Hey, it was good enough for the monks when they were fasting for 40 days, and they were limited to they had their 3 liters per day, not in one sitting, but, you know, and that was spread out throughout the day, that and their herbal teas and water, and, right, over the sort of 16 hours that they were awake, right? So that's really ingrained into the culture. It took about 3 years to actually fully institute the ban on alcohol in chemical plants in Bavaria.
They still treated it as an alcoholic beverage for, like, driving purposes, I'm assuming, right?
Well, actually, Germany is very strict about drunk driving. Very, very, very
Most
strict.
of the rest of the world is, I know.
Yeah, I think El Salvador is punishable by death.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's taken quite seriously.
I'm just
But-
trying to imagine, like, if I walk in here with a mug of beer, it's like, no, you can't.
Well, you know, the idea of a dry campus is something most Europeans would think that you have 3 heads, if you say that. But Pennsylvania has a very different history. Pennsylvania was a dry state prior to the Volstead Act being signed. So, I mean, I don't want to get into PA history. I'll save that for my esteemed colleague, Martin. But anyway. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you for coming. It's been fun. Thanks.